Greetings, and thank you for joining today's program, Financial Resolutions for 2024. For those that don't know me, my name is Kristen Kolish. I'm a financial advisor with Raymond James. And the purpose of today's call is to help position yourself to make 2024 a productive year financially. Now, that means something different to everyone on the call. Many of today's participants are currently in the workplace, though some are already retired. I'm going to be casting a pretty wide net in regards to the range of topics. We're going to talk about budgeting, portfolio management, even get into a little bit of insurance and estate planning. The nature of the comments are meant to be evergreen, meaning we're talking about fundamentals, regardless of whether the market's up or down. However, throughout the conversation, I'll sprinkle in some market observations and commentary as appropriate. I ask that you spend the time listening and taking in the information. I do plan to distribute the slides and even a recording of the program, so it's not necessary to take detailed notes. You can even feel free to share the recording and the information with others that you may know that you think might benefit from the discussion. And lastly, let me reiterate the comment the phrase that's at the bottom of this screen here. Don't let perfection get in the way of progress. I love that saying. For some of you, if you feel like some of this information is a bit overwhelming, choose one, maybe two actionable ideas to tackle this year. The goal is not for you to walk away with a laundry list of to-dos, but more to get you thinking about what's your next right move? What's your next right decision? And perhaps this is just an affirmation that you're on the right track. So I'm actually going to take myself off of video so you can focus on the visuals that I'm going to be sharing. And at the end of the program, I'll hop back on to wrap that up. So where I like to start is actually giving you some rhetorical questions for consideration. They may seem a little deep to get the conversation going today, but it kind of gets you in an interesting frame of mind. And we're going to circle back to this with my last resolution before we close out today's discussion. The first is, what's the best financial decision that you have ever made? Some of these questions you may have never considered, so I can appreciate if this is giving you pause for thought. What's your earliest memory of money, and has that helped or hurt you over the years? What's a financial decision that you regret, and what did you learn from that mistake? And then lastly, and this is a biggie, what's your why? Meaning, what is your vision of your financial future, and has that been communicated to your family? Is that something that you're discussing? And spoiler alert, the last resolution has to do with communication around money, which fully acknowledging that the conversation of money and investing can be a stressful topic. It can be an emotional topic. It's one that in our society is generally taboo. We don't generally talk about it in a public setting unless you're very comfortable with the people that you're around. But communication with your spouse, communication with your family is so very important. So give some of these questions some consideration and think about what that has meant and how this has informed your personal financial journey. Because the last question of what is your vision ties directly in what we're getting into here. When you think about a financial goal, this is the what, the how, and the when. What are you saving for? When do you need to buy or use the money, and how much will it cost you? And goals could be big goals, like I want to stop working and I need to fund my lifestyle, hopefully for decades in retirement. It could be a smaller goal, like paying down a credit card debt if you have. But ultimately, we do tend to have competing priorities. And whether you have got tens of millions of dollars in the bank, whether you're just starting out, there often is trade-offs when it comes to decisions about cash flow, about spending, how you're using your financial resources. Because when you think about what is investing, why would an investor buy a stock or a bond or put money in their savings account? Well, investing is really just delayed consumption. We're not spending our money today. We're doing something with it so that we can use it at some point in the future. So for all of the potential resolutions that I'm going to throw out, I just want to reiterate the messaging I started with, which is to go easy on yourself. Acknowledge that changes in your lives could be a reason to revisit a financial plan. And I love the idea of thinking about your next right financial decision. What's the next right move? When you start to think about, and especially if I go back to this slide, if you have a number of different goals, personally, I'm saving for my children's college education. Retirement is not in the near future, but I know I can't overlook that goal. That could be a little bit overwhelming and a lot. So just to focus on what is that next right step for you. The first thing to do is to take financial inventory. And you do that once a year, maybe a couple times a year, but knowing what you own and knowing what you owe. So that's your personal assets and liabilities. What are you putting away versus what you need? So just like companies have balance sheets and cash flow statements and profit statements, so do individuals. And we just may not realize it at the time. This is something that you should know and manage. So let's first consider what your spending looks like. And I do want to start by saying that you're probably thinking, well, I would have less financial troubles if I made more money, if my income was higher. But this idea of understanding your cash flow is relevant not just to workers, but also to retirees, regardless of your income level. You should know what's going in and what's going out. And what were you planning for? Are you on track? Oftentimes, when it comes to families and couples, this might be a point of contention, or it may be something that you avoid communication about. But ultimately, the goal is to give every dollar you have a job. And I love the phrase at the bottom of this slide. Think of your budget as a permission slip and not a diet. Who likes to be on a diet? No one wants to be on a diet. We think about diets being restrictive. And if we're thinking about our budget in that way, then spending the money that we've earned also feels restrictive. Well, you save for the things that are important to you. Oftentimes I find that retirees will come to my teammates and I almost asking for permission about spending their money. And of course, this is theirs. Excuse me. In terms of income, we're talking about employment, investments, expenditures, what are essentials, what are investments, and what's your cash reserve. Now, lifestyle, I want to bring up a phrase that kind of resonates. I mentioned before, you could still make a lot of money and have to worry about being on a budget, or at least knowing where your cash flows go. There is a such thing as you move along in your career as a lifestyle creep, which means the more money you make, the more comfortable you are, maybe the less attention you're paying to where your cash flow goes. This is not a criticism. If you make more and want to spend more, that's fine. But go back to give every dollar a job. And is money evaporating, or are you using it for a purpose? There are budget worksheets that we can provide to you that can help you guide on specific expense items. But ultimately, the back of the envelope way to think about your spending is how much money did you make? How much money did you save? How much did you pay in taxes? And then the difference of those three items is what you spent. Compare that to your line item budget, and oftentimes there's a gap between the two. So looking at this on a monthly basis, even in the beginning, once you're first getting started on a weekly basis, is very important. And for those who are currently saving, you may be thinking, where should my next dollar go? Well, first you want to start off have an emergency reserve. That's 3 to 6 months living expenses. We're going to talk about cash in a minute and the role that cash plays as part of your financial plan, but you want to make sure that you don't have to sell securities during market weakness, or take a loan, for instance, off of 401k because you don't have the wherewithal to fund unexpected expenses as they arise. I'm going to talk a little bit more about HSA's health savings account. I'll give you a little bit of a glimpse. That particular account is almost like magic because it's triple tax exempt. Then you want to maximize any employer contribution for those who are still in the workforce. To the extent that you have debt, looking to pay down high interest loans, and then you go back to the additional savings vehicles. And depending on your income, maybe that's considering saving in a Roth IRA. For those who have children and grandchildren, you can make a contribution to a Roth IRA as long as you have W-2 income. And the magic about the Roth IRA account is that you're making an after-tax contribution that's growing tax exempt. So the earlier you start, the more exponentially important those assets become, because it's compounding over years, even decades. And ultimately, an individual investor is may reach certain income limits. So I've seen where children or grandchildren, as soon as they have a job, maybe in high school or in college, thinking about opening a Roth immediately, maybe matching it, for instance, to entice them to save. Because ultimately, we know that the earlier you start investing, the better off you're going to be. The best way to make money in the market is to have your money working for you when you're not working. I love this Warren Buffett phrase, someone's sitting in the shade today because someone planted a tree a long time ago. Well, you want to be the one planting those seeds. And for illustrative purposes, we've got four individual savers here. I'm not going to go through every single number, but thematically, Jane is the smartest one. She started off in her mid-20s saving in her retirement account. And by the time she reached retirement, even though she had only contributed $500,000 during her working years, assuming an average rate of return of 6%, she had $2 million when she retired. Now compare that to John, who just waited 10 years. I mean, I think on all accounts, most people would think, 30s, starting to think about retirement, maybe that's pretty good. Well, he only contributed $375,000. And because he cut off those first 10 years, he had about half of what Jane had. And poor Chris didn't get started until retirement was right around the corner and had a fraction of that. So whether you're starting out or whether your children or grandchildren are starting out, this is such an important concept to internalize and to act on, because you think about, even if it's 1-2% of the income that you're making, just to get started, you think about how quickly that dollar amount can evaporate on a night out or a weekend away versus putting it away, investing it, what that can buy you in the future. There's a huge delta there. And there's actually a great commercial today by an app called NerdWallet. And the idea is, what would your future self think about what you're doing today? And the vision is an investor 40 years down the road, they're living because of the way that they're living, the choices that they have to make are informed by when they were, 40 years older and 40 years younger. And that's so important. I talked about cash reserves. This is relevant regardless of your income level and even your life stage. What's interesting today is that over the last 2 years, interest rates have gone up. So investors are actually in a position where you are earning a rate of return on cash. Go back 2, 3, 5 years. There was it was next to nothing, sometimes nothing on your cash. So you think about why you own cash. Cash is not really an asset class that's part of a long-term portfolio in any great percentages. Cash is meant to give you flexibility and liquidity for not only daily needs, but emergencies that may, or even opportunities that may come down the pike. It gives you the wherewithal to kind of live through market volatility. So for investors who are no longer receiving a paycheck, I'm actually encouraging folks to hold a little bit more cash than you otherwise would. The markets have been strong. 2023 stocks were up, generally speaking, double digits. Bonds were also positive. In some ways, we were earning back the losses of 2022, but trimming from strength could make sense to fund cash needs over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. Now, the investment portfolio is really where your assets are going to grow. And I think about, what would inform the way that you invest? Well, certainly where we started, your financial goals, but also your time horizon on when you're going to spend the money. And generally speaking, the longer time you have, the more likelihood you can own growth investments. So whether that is where you are today to retirement, or maybe you're in a position where some of your assets are going to be left to your heirs, so a portion of your portfolio can be considered multi-generational wealth, that's in a position where you can take on a little bit more risk. So you want to be checking in to see how are you doing on your path towards that vision that we talked about, whether that's retirement or another goal. You want to understand your sources of income. So we talked before about expenses, what's discretionary, what's non-discretionary. But in retirement, the challenge is that you no longer have a paycheck, right? So you've got to take assets, and the retirement industry is focused so heavily on getting savers and investors to accumulate assets. The challenge is, well, how do I manage the distribution phase when I'm ultimately spending down the portfolio? And if you are a female investor and saver, you have opportunities and challenges. On average, women live 5 years longer than men, and that has financial implications. It means during our working years, we need to be saving more. So thinking about how that longevity plays into your portfolio is an important part of planning for your future. I love this slide here. It's not a panacea. This is just meant to give you some guidance. I often get asked, I don't know, am I on the right track? Have I saved enough? Well, in your working years, a good goal is to be saving 15% of your income. That gets a little tricky. I heard on my way into work this morning, for instance, that rent expense is at the highest it's ever been, and that the average renter is actually spending over 30% of their income in rent, which is a noose around your neck in a lot of different ways. So challenge yourself, if you're in that savings mode, to be increasing by 1-2% a year if you can. The example here shows at various investor ages how much you should have saved based on your income. So at the age of 35, you should have saved at least what you're making. At the age of 40, 2 times, appreciating that over time, generally your income does go up. So this is very back of the envelope, but in a lot of ways for investors who start late, this could be pretty intimidating. At the age of 50, if you make $200,000, you should have at least $1 million in the bank. And way back when, saying someone was a millionaire was like, wow, now you need to be a millionaire to retire for a number of different reasons, not the least of which is that most people don't have traditional pensions today. And on average, we are living longer. So what additional tools or resources could we think that could help you in the future? Well, one potential resolution is to think about the way that you're planning for medical expenses in retirement, in your future, and even balancing it today. I mean, I have a family. I know how expensive medical can be between premiums and being in a high deductible plan. The idea of the health savings account, the power of this account is that you get to save in a tax advantaged way. It grows tax advantaged. And then if you spend it for qualifying medical expenses, that's also tax exempt. So you may be eligible for an HSA if you have a high deductible plan, you're not enrolled in Medicare and have no other health care coverage, and are not a dependent. I show you here the 2024 contribution limits. Why is this so important? It's because the average healthy couple can expect to spend over $300,000 during their retirement years in out-of-pocket health expenses. That's excluding long-term care, according to Fidelity. That's a big nut. And the way that I would suggest using an HSA is, to the extent that during your working years, you can afford to cover your medical expenses out of pocket, the dollars you save in an HSA, invest them and let them compound. Let the growth on your savings grow, and let that growth on the savings grow. I saw a stat that less than 30% of HSA investments assets are actually held in investing. And that's a lost opportunity. Now, I appreciate there's some folks where cash flow is a challenge and they just can't afford not to hit their HSA for medical expenses. But the magic of this account is that there is no expiration on receipts. So you may be thinking, well, what if I'm super healthy and I don't have these expenses in retirement? Well, I could take a bill I have today, let's say for elective surgery, and I could submit it against my HSA account 20 years later and take out a tax-free distribution, all the while my assets are invested and growing. So if you have an HSA account, think about contributing. And also, if you have a balance, make sure that you are using the investment feature and that you're not just letting it sit in cash, using it as a flexible spending account. Another resolution for this year you may consider is revisiting your asset allocation. And this applies for all life stages. So this is the amount that you have in stocks, bonds, and cash. And this is driven by two components. What are your financial objectives and time horizon? And the other is, what's your personal comfort level with risk? Now, admittedly, we face all different types of risks, right? Right now, I'm talking about market risk, your comfort or your ability to withstand the risk of your portfolio declining, and to a certain extent. Now, the financial industry will have you believe that, picking the best managers and the best stocks is what's going to get you to your financial goals. Something that's not highly publicized is that actually over 90% of an investor's return is determined by the split between stocks, bonds, and cash. Yes, of course, security selection is important, but not nearly as important as the amount of risk you're choosing to take in your portfolio. So you should know, what is the split between your return-seeking investments and the investments that I'd consider risk mitigating, cash, high-quality bonds, and the like. Now, after a year like 2023, it's interesting to look at where your portfolio value is today versus, let's say, 12 months ago. And this is the whole idea of rebalancing. Now, to rebalance your portfolio, you need to have initially had a target of stocks, bonds, and cash. So here we show 25% mix amongst various asset classes. And after a year's time, you're overweighted towards the higher risk because, let's say, stocks had a nice year. Well, the idea of rebalancing means that you're trimming from the winners and adding to the losers, and vice versa. And that's something that, as a financial advisor, we do for our clients. If you've got a balance in a 401k, you can very oftentimes set up rebalancing so that's done automatically. But this is a great way to mitigate risk over time. So speaking of risk, let's transition to other types of risks. Risks that you might consider insurance to manage. And that's something that if you're, this does get informed by life stage for sure. If you think about when you're starting out and you have a family, well, the risk is that God forbid something happens to the breadwinner or the person who's taking care of the children, where you need life insurance. So term life insurance is very important for families. Even disability insurance. And the amount that you're provided through your employer may or may not be enough to get you to the point where you're mitigating your risk. Long-term care insurance, that's an interesting one because the industry is changing as we speak. It's a relatively new industry in that just now are folks starting to be using their benefit. We've seen a transition to more hybrid policies so that it's not as common to buy a standalone long-term care insurance policy. Those can be very expensive, maybe a hybrid between long-term care and a portion that maybe has a rider that has a life insurance policy. So think about where you are in your life and what are your risks. If something happened to you today, what is your insurable interest is the concept I want to throw out. And you may not have to buy a life insurance policy to mitigate that. There are plenty of investors and savers who do what I call self-insuring, particularly on the long-term care side. If you do a great job of saving during your working years, you may have the wherewithal in your portfolio to cover medical expenses and care expenses as they arise. The other important point here is to know what is covered and what is not covered, and think about what you want to have happen for yourself and for your spouse and your family in retirement. Is it important for you to have home care? And you want to include that in your insurance policy. Many insurance policies are written so that you're only going to be covered if you move into a nursing home or an assisted living place. So thinking about what your future looks like is going to help inform what insurance or what risk mitigating strategies you should be employing. Here's some myths as it relates to life insurance. For one, for those who are maybe raising a family, stay-at-home parents don't need life insurance. Well, God forbid something happened to that person. That's a void. That's probably the best deal you've ever gotten on a stay-at-home parent in terms of if you had to replicate those roles and responsibilities and pay someone, that's an expense that you would need insurance to cover. I mentioned before that work benefits may not be enough. And the price of insurance may or may not be more expensive for women. And ultimately, if you have health issues, that is not a guarantee that you're not going to get coverage. So it's worth looking into for sure. There's different ways to do that. If you have questions, you can certainly feel free to reach out. The next topic I want to talk a little bit about is updating your estate plan. And again, as I'm talking, for you personally, think about, okay, what's the one or two things that's applicable to myself and my family that I do want to act on? And the estate plan is something that, I think most people know that, okay, let's say you start a family. Well, I need a will because I need to name a guardian for my children. Okay, great. Well, then you may have that will and your financial situation could change a number of different times, but you're not going back and revisiting that. So life happens, as we know. You want to make sure that the names on accounts are reviewed. Let's talk a little bit about how assets are passed. A will determines what happens to your assets if you pass away. It also determines who the executor is and who is, let's say, guardian to your children. However, 401k, IRA, Roth IRA, HSA, Those all pass by beneficiary designation. So it's not enough to update your will. You want to make sure you're looking at your will in conjunction with the beneficiaries. There's other estate planning strategies that, that you may consider, including POA, that stands for Power of Attorney. POA for financial affairs empowers someone to make financial decisions on your behalf. For instance, we have clients at Raymond James where their spouses have POA on each other's accounts. It may be because one spouse is more involved in the decisions than the other. It could be because, God forbid something happens to someone, there's someone who's authorized to make decisions. There's also a power of attorney as it relates to medical directives. So someone can take action and make medical decisions. The living will, that's related to the POA for medical directive, but this really only comes into play when you're in a position where you can no longer make health choices yourself. That's when the living will comes into play, and it really has to do with end of life choices. It may or may not be advantageous for you to have a revocable living trust. This would not be applicable for retirement accounts. This would be for a taxable account. And the reason why some investors choose to put assets in a revocable trust is because that could then avoid probate, which can be, depending on the state that you live in, either an expensive and or just cumbersome process. So here I list a number of different events that may cause you to revisit your estate plan, not the least of which would be getting married, birth of a child, buying a home, getting a divorce, getting retired, moving, changing residencies. Those are all reasons to revisit your estate plan. And then also legislation. So the current rules as it relates to the amount of assets that you can pass without paying estate tax is set to sunset in 2025. So I expect over the course of next year for us to hear more about that. So there's all sorts of reasons why you may look to revisit your estate plan. And ultimately, I'm bringing the conversation back to where we started, which is one of communication when it comes to your finances. What questions did I ask at the beginning? What's the best financial decision you've made? Earliest memory? What's your vision for your wealth? Some of those questions are things that require a little bit of self-reflection. Related to the estate plan, there's an additional document that's actually not a legal document, but some of our clients have chosen to write or to at least think about. It's called an ethical will. And the ethical will is really more a documentation for you to crystallize for your heirs, kind of what are your views about your family financial position? What are the values that you relied upon in saving during your lifetime, and as you made choices about what you're spending and what you're saving, and really what you want to see happen in the future with assets that you may leave behind. Now, not to get a little too hokey, but those assets could be financial for sure, assets in a brokerage account or a savings account, but also when you think about human capital assets, what are your values? What are the things that are important to you that you want your family to live on and think about? So that's something that resonates with some, may not resonate with others, but you can reach out if that's something that you wanted to explore more fully. And, have a conversation. At the least, make sure that you're communicating with your spouse. I've done over the years a number of different, and I'm going to make a generalization here, so take that with a bit of a grain of salt, is that I've done a number of different women in investing programs. Now, I've got plenty of clients where the female investor is a primary decision maker, but there's a lot of clients where maybe the male has kind of taken that role. And I'm not saying that each spouse needs to, spend hours opining over your investments, but you should at least have a comfort level with your financial position. You should broadly know how much you spend, how much you save, what you have in assets. How long is that going to cover you? Those are things that it's knowledge is power. And are there any concerns that anyone has? And have you communicated this? Do you feel comfortable communicating any of this to your children? We're living in a time where the way we shared information has changed. So one potential resolution could be for you to get organized. I've got this on my list. The idea of having all of your documents in a fireproof safe, um, while I don't want to say is irrelevant, it's not, but how many of your records are also digital? So you want to make sure that you've taken an inventory of your digital estate. This is actually one of the things that I see estate planning attorneys update in the will when that gets revised, is an acknowledgement that there's information and assets that the executor, for instance, should have access to that can only be accessed digitally. Now, with that comes the concern about security. So you want to make sure that you're not just leaving your passwords on on the screen of your computer. And also thinking about ways to declutter and making sure that you're shredding papers that have information that should be protected. So here we're talking about centralizing, decluttering, and securing those assets. I mentioned at the beginning that this process of thinking about financial resolutions and investing can be overwhelming, whether it's making a decision about something that you may not have the expertise or the comfort to make. Maybe it's the fear of, if I get started, what if this is not enough? I do want to acknowledge that, because if you know going in that the process of investing is going to trigger certain emotions, that's powerful, because we want to use that to our advantage. The markets tend to move in cycles and tend to move in extremes. The visual here is not of a specific year or specific cycle, but generally speaking, as the financial markets go up in value, consumer confidence goes up, we feel more comfortable investing. And investing is not supposed to be comfortable, right? There is a component to risk and return. If you're taking more risk, you should expect more return. But what is risk? Risk is the possibility that your portfolio balance could decline. So during periods, let's say how we felt in early 2020, when in a 5-week period, we saw the markets go down as quick as it ever had at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, you might have been tempted to sell because you didn't know what the future holds. And in retrospect, it is, hindsight's 2020. It's easy to say, no, I would have sat still. I would have continued to invest. But many people didn't. Many people get scared out of the market. And the idea of investing, I want to bring this back because it's a very fundamental concept, is that you are a consumer. So if you're buying a share of stock, you are a consumer of that stock. You're a part business owner. And you think about, when do you want to buy things other than financial assets? When do you want to go shopping for a car or for a house or for a winter coat, for instance? You want to do that when those prices are low, when prices are on sale. The financial markets are the only markets I can think of where our tendency is to buy after prices have gone up, because maybe subconsciously we're thinking, okay, well, it's gone up, so it's got to be a good investment, so it's got to continue to go up. But that's not the way this works. As long as you're not being speculative and not taking on too much risk in your portfolio, say you've got a diversified mix of different types of stocks and other asset classes, then if markets sell off significantly, you know, what we've seen over time is that the more patience you can have, you're going to be compensated for that patience. In fact, over the last 100 years, in 80% of 12-month rolling periods, the stock market was positive, 80%. In 20%, it was negative. The average annual return of the stock market during that period was 10%, yet the mix of returns is not a bell-shaped curve where the highest frequency is at the average. It's actually on more extreme. So the bond market is more like that, but with the stock market, you're more likely to, let's say, 2022 and 2023 are prime examples. In 2022, the S&P 500 was down 18%. So maybe that here is, maybe the feeling you're at is at capitulation or despondency on this graph. But then, you know, fast forward 2023, the S&P 500 was up 26%. So you need to think about what level of risk are you comfortable with? If you saw your portfolio value decline by, let's say, 20%, what would be your reaction? So I don't like to talk in percentage terms. I like to talk in dollars. So if you had $1 million portfolio on January 1st, and by, let's say, December 31st, that value was 800,000, what would your reaction be? Now, listen, no one's going to be happy about it. Let's just throw that out there. But if it's at 800,000, are you going to say, stop the bleeding? I've got to sell my stock because I can't live through going down? Or have you properly planned and had some reflection on your personal tolerance for risk to know that, you know what, as long as I have cash on the sidelines to meet my near-term living expenses, I'm going to let this ride. And over time, the investors who can have that level of patience have been rewarded for that patience. As a matter of fact, I say a lot that individual investors in many ways are better positioned than professional money managers to do well during market volatility. And that's because money managers are subject to the whims of investors. You want your money, I have to sell to raise money to pay out my distributions. But as an individual investor, you theoretically have control over whether or not you're choosing to sell. Now, of course, as I mentioned more than once, that's all predicated on proper cash flow management. I do want to acknowledge that this feels a little different when you have a paycheck than when you don't have a paycheck, right? So that's why the planning, I'd say the 5 to 10 years before retirement is really the time to take a closer look to ensure that what you've saved is enough, not just for periods that are strong, but also stress testing your portfolio to see if you go through, because you live long enough, you're going to see a period of market weakness. Is your portfolio strong enough to meet and sustain your current lifestyle during that type of environment? And oftentimes the sequence of returns when you start to spend from the portfolio has an impact in your success. So think about someone who retired, let's say, in the year 2007. So rewind back to the great financial crisis. They not only were they starting to draw from their portfolio, but they had continuous consecutive years of significant market decline. They were in worse financial shape than someone who retired, let's say, in 2022 and saw 2023 market returns go up. Now, that, of course, is outside of our control, but does inform and require you to think about, okay, well, what would happen if the market went up? What would happen if the market went down? And kind of the goal for you is to have a level playing field. You want to be fearful when others are greedy, look for opportunities, and greedy when others are fearful. So going into 2024, I read an interesting fact that Wall Street analysts are off by over 10% per year in terms of their predictions. So I don't put much weight in that. But a nice reminder is that volatility in the stock market is normal. If you saw a decline from here, that wouldn't surprise me. But ultimately come back to, when are you going to be spending this pool of assets? And if you are going to be spending the money in the next, 6 months to 3 years, then it should be more conservative. As you extend your time horizon, you can take on a little bit more risk. So I appreciate you listening to my remarks today. I know we kind of went all over the map in terms of the topics that we covered, but I would take one point and see if you can make some progress on that in the year 2024. It is going to be, we'll see where the market takes us. So far, we're January 2024, we actually have reached a point where the S&P is back to the height of 2021, which is interesting. It took us this long to get there, which may mean that it's a great time to look at your portfolio and see if you should be rebalancing your account. You can feel free to type a question into the Q&A box if you do have one. You can also feel free to reach out with any questions you may have. Many of you have my contact information, but for those that don't, it's 845-512-1114. A question that I've received recently is how to be thinking about, let's say, Social Security and Medicare. There are some key ages. So once you reach the early 60s, that's a great time for us to actually do a Social Security or Medicare analysis for you. So please reach out if you are at that particular point in your lives. And then that's something that if you're continuing to work, that'll be informed by. Because with that Social Security piece, to the extent that you can push past your full retirement age, you're going to be able to earn 8% more a year. I see a question about viewing assets at different accounts. That's not something that I have visibility into. But if you have questions about assets that you may hold there, you can certainly feel free to reach out individually. For some of our, either through Raymond James, also through some of the 401k partners that we work with, there's the ability to bring in outside assets so that you could see as a hub in one spot all of your assets together. And ultimately, that's a very important way to think about your portfolio, is that we have a tendency to think in silos. I have my 401k, I have my individual investments, and I have my savings. Excuse me. But you should be thinking about what your global asset allocation is, and whether it's through Raymond James or whether it's through, let's say, your retirement account. That's a great idea, is to be able to view it in one spot. Now, the technology is such that you could log in and get that set up, but you may have to, each time you log in, from a cybersecurity standpoint, a lot of vendors are moving towards something called dual authentication. And that's where you put in your username and password, but then you're prompted to put an additional code that they're, for instance, going to send by a text to your cell. From a cybersecurity standpoint, that makes me feel good. From a nuisance standpoint, it's just an additional step, but I do love the idea of having a home base where you can view all of your financial assets in one spot, for sure. So I appreciate that, and thank you for that question. So with that, I'd like to wrap up and wish you all the best for a healthy and a prosperous 2024. Feel free to reach out with any individual questions, and we'll take it from there. Have a great day.